Part 3, the rise of militarist Zionism. As I've mentioned in our class, there's a tendency to associate militarist Zionism primarily with the revisionist Zionist branch, though, of course, it is far from an accurate description. The early organizations of self-defense were very much anchored in the labor Zionist experience. The first example is, of course, the group Hashomer, literally meaning the guard or the watchman, that was established in 1909 and that was disbanded only in 1920. And we've discussed this in class, and I do not want to go into further detail, but this was, of course, a Jewish defense organization that was founded by the members of the Second Aliyah. It was an outgrowth of an earlier group that was called Bar Giora group that was established 2 years earlier, that was named after Shimon Bar Giora, who was one of those mythological leaders of the great revolt of the against the Romans in 70 AD. Shomer was very much had a very strong tie with not only with the Zionist ideologies, but also with the experience of living in a small agricultural settlement and the idea that part of the labor Zionist experience is not only about learning how to work the land, but also how to defend the land, and one cannot delegate the work to Arab strongmen. They were not willing to rely on non-Jewish guards, and they were explicitly talking about the term kibush hashmira, conquering the guard, the security, the guard, the same way as they were talking explicitly about kibush adama, the conquest of the land. So these were, for them, two sides of the same coin. Now, Shomer was responsible, of course, guarding the Jewish settlement in the Yishuv, and freeing the Jewish communities from their dependence upon what they considered to be foreign consulates and the Arab watchmen. And this is, of course, a very important movement. And as I've mentioned, the motto they chose was already hyper nationalistic. In fire and blood did Judea fall. In blood and fire Judea shall rise. A metaphor that is classic example of what Anthony Smith called the ethno-symbolic synthesis of modern nationalism. They are tying themselves imaginatively with the ancient Roman revolt against the Roman oppressors. The reality is, of course, of a much more smaller scale operation. And I also turned your attention to their physical and external appearances, the way they were dressed. You can see that they were dressed as the local Arabs, riding the horses like the local Arabs, and sort of learning from them how to protect the land. And this is part of a cultural appropriation that is not disconnected with this ambivalent love-hate relationship with the local Arab neighbor. Often the idea of becoming more rooted in the land was connected with the deep desire to learn from the native Arab how to do it. 2014, there was an Israeli satirical show that ran in the Israeli television, a group of comedians that called themselves Hayehudim Ba'im, the Jews are coming, and this comedy group had a very funny sketch in which they mocked the beginning of this of Hashomer movement. I will post it online. You do not need to understand the Hebrew to understand the dynamic. The newcomers from Russia are coming and asking the Arab neighbor how to dress, how to talk, how to behave, even how to shoot a rifle, and then you will see what is happening. It's a short, less than 5 minute video clip. I will post it online, and I hope you will enjoy it. But this is not usually the beginning of the Shomer is not the usual date of birth that many historians will use in order to talk about the beginning of the Jewish-Arab conflict. In a sense, part of what is interesting about these early stages is the fluidity, the way that the Jew could imagine himself as turning into, quote unquote, an Oriental and a Semite that is integrating into the region. And also the violence was often dismissed as neighborly disputes of a small scale. After the British conquest of Palestine, you have a different type of riots. Not only the scales are changing, but also the pattern of the violence. And maybe one of the dates that some historians would like to put their finger on and call this the date of birth of the Israeli-Palestine conflict is the Jaffa riots of 1921 that went down in Zionist chronicles as Me'ora'ot Tarpa. Tarpa is the Hebrew calendar for the year 1921. So these are the events or the stormy events of 1921. This is a series of violent riots. It took place in May 1921. It started off as a local fight between two Jewish groups, but developed into an attack by Arab and Jews during an entire week. And the rioting began in Jaffa and spread to throughout entire country. And it took a week until calm was restored, started in May 1st and ended in May 7th. Now, the riot resulted in the death of 47 Jews and 48 Arabs. 146 Jews and 73 Arabs were wounded. And it was remembered by the Zionists in particular because one of those who were murdered in Jaffa was a very famous author, novelist by the name of Yosef Chaim Brenner, who was a very iconic figure of the Second Aliyah, a very prolific, talented writer, someone who actually had a very critical mindset and cast of mind, but died as a martyr. And if you would like, he became a bit of the John Lennon or the Che Guevara of the Second Aliyah, someone who became even far more famous due to his due to the fact that he ended his life a bit as a martyr. So his critical stance, in a way, was pushed aside for the vision of Brenner as one of those who were killed in 1921. It was in the context of deteriorating safety of Jews on the one hand, and at the same time guidance by the British, that you see also new type of paramilitary organization among the Jews. And most important in that respect is the establishment of the Haganah, literally defense, in wake of riots in the early 1920s, not only in Jaffa, but also on different event that I will mention later in Tel Hai. And this is strength, sort of this dependence upon the British. This is not an underground illegal military force or paramilitary force, but it's something that is actually done under the auspices of the British. Their training was not done in secret. And during the first years of its existence, the Haganah was a very loose organization of local defense groups in towns and several settlements, but especially in the late 20s, in the wake of the Arab riots of 1929, they became their thinking shifted. They were thinking in sort of a nationwide, countrywide strategic defense plan, and it became a much larger organization encompassing nearly all the youth and adults in the Yeshuv, in the pre-statehood Jewish settlements, as well as several thousand members from each of those cities. Now, if you even look at the photo in front of you, you can already see that they're different from HaShomer. They're wearing uniform. They're not trying to pretend themselves to be local Bedouin or Arabs that are learning how to defend themselves from the neighbors, but someone who are people that are craving to have professional European military training. The Haganah was also very important because it went hand in hand with the establishment of kibbutzim and kvutzot, and also went hand in hand with sort of the promise of gender equality you can find in the labor Zionists. And you can see here in this photo women being trained by the Haganah. And this was an integral part of the special spirit of the Haganah. And you won't be surprised to hear that this organization, of course, would become one of the key elements, nucleuses of the future Israeli defense forces that will play a very important role in the 1948 war. And even the symbol, the icon, the emblem of the Haganah, the sword that is meets with the branch of olive tree, is one of the symbols that made its way from the Haganah in pre-settled Palestine to the symbols of modern contemporary IDF, the Israeli army today. And of course, it's a symbol of that. It tries to bring together two contradictions, war and peace, right? So, and this is a part of the ethos of the Haganah defense that entered, then recast itself in the name of the Israeli army, IDF, Israel Defense Forces. Now, I've mentioned in brief the 1929 riots, and these riots are, if you like, one of the other watershed moments and climatic moments of violent eruption that other historians tend to look at them as maybe the best date in which where one should begin the Arab-Israel, counting the chronicles of the Arab-Israeli conflict. During this week of riots that started in the summer, on August 23rd, 1929, 133 Jews were killed by Arabs, and 339 others were injured, while 110 Arabs were killed and 232 were injured, the vast majority by the British police that were trying to suppress the riots. And during these riots, 17 different Jewish communities were evacuated, and it was a very traumatic experience, especially when riots took place in places like Jerusalem, Safat, Jaffa, Hebron, and Moza. The case of Hebron is very interesting, and the photo you see in front of you is from the Hebron massacre. In this case, the Arab Muslim community attacked yeshiva students who were non-Zionist. They were not affiliated with the Zionist parties, and the Jewish settlement in Hebron predated even the Zionist colonizations. And as we mentioned, it was part of those 4 holy cities. So it was seen by many as an example of a new, very sinister type of nationalism that has a crude, even anti-Semitic tint to it, that is not attacking only the so-called Zionist colonizers, but attacking Jews for the sake of them, of their Jewishness. And you can see also the front page of the newspaper Davar, the daily newspaper of the labor Zionist movement, with a long, long list of the martyrs of those riots. My friend and colleague, the historian Hillel Cohen, who teaches at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, wrote a brilliant book that argued exactly what I've just suggested, that actually if you look at 1929, and especially if you take seriously the deep scars and the traumas of that year, you can argue that we should start the story of the Arab-Israeli conflict in that traumatic Indian summer. One of the reasons and one of the excuses that Hillel Cohen is using in his book is that if you look at people that were young children during the 1929 riots, some of whom survived the riots but saw the atrocities firsthand and witnessed them, many of these would later become key figures in the 1948 war. And one of the examples that Hillel Cohen uses is the story of Mordechai Maklaf. His family came from a small settlement named Moza at the outskirts of Jerusalem. They lived peacefully next to their Arab neighbors for many years. They trusted them. But when the riots erupted, other Arabs from more distant villages, not their immediate neighbors, came, slaughtered Mordechai Maklaf's family in front of his eyes. He escaped. And of course, as the story becomes even more complicated, one of the people who help him to run away is an Arab neighbor. And Mordechai Maklaf was in a way almost the single survivor of his entire family from this massacre. He was, of course, deeply traumatized. In World War II, he will volunteer to join the British Army. In 1948, he will become a very important general in the Israeli army, and he will be the one that will orchestrate the conquest of Haifa that was seen as a very brutal conquest, one of the places in which the IDF had a gloves-off approach and did not shy away from pushing civilians to flee away from Haifa. So one of the arguments that is being made that you can understand, not excuse, but understand why Maklaf was so brutal in 1948 if you take into consideration his experiences and the baggage he carries, brings into the war of 1948 from his youth in 1929. It is interesting, therefore, to mention that whether you accept Hillel Cohen's thesis about 1929 as the date of birth, or you look at earlier dates, it was already before 1929 that Ze'ev Vladimir Jabotinsky publishes a very important essay that in a way turned into idiomatic phrase, namely the Iron Wall. It was published in November 1923. It was originally even written in Russian. And you can see here a very key and bold statement about the way Zionism should respond and behave towards the Arab neighbor. And this is what Jabotinsky said, an excerpt from his famous essay, I quote, "There can be no voluntary agreement between ourselves and the Palestine Arabs, not now, nor in the prospective future. I say this without such conviction, not because I want to hurt the moderate Zionists. I do not believe that they will be hurt, except for those who were born blind. They realized long ago that it is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestinian Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all the precedents which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. The native population, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage," end quote. I'm using this excerpt for several reasons. A, you can see the contrast between Herzl's lofty and sort of a wishful thinking approach when he imagined the Arabs' response to Zionism through the image of Rashid Bey. Actually, you can see here, if you'd like, this consistency that sometimes the Zionists found the Arab resistance to be admirable. It shows that they are authentic, they are not sissies, but also because this is a key statement of Jabotinsky that in a way pushed him to create a separate, alternative, revisionist Zionist movement that will challenge the mainstream Zionist organization, exactly because he felt that the moderate Zionists are trying to shy away, not to talk boldly about the Arab question, and not to understand that what we have here is a colonial struggle, and therefore the aim is to create a clear Jewish majority. Few words about Jabotinsky, because he's a key figure, of course, in our discussion in this session. So as I've mentioned earlier, he was born in Odessa, the famous city that was sort of a cultural center in Russia of the late 19th century. And he started his career as a Russian a member of the Russian intelligentsia, writing brilliantly in Russian, considering the career of an author, a novelist, a playwright, and his first writings are of the literary kind. It would be only in 1903 that he would join the new Zionist monthly journal named The Jewish Life, that was later renamed Razviet, which means in Russian advice, where he publishes many of his essays, including the essay we just discussed. In World War I, Jabotinsky plays a very central role in establishing the Zion Mule Corps, a unit that would join the British Army and will play a role in one of the most famous battles the British Army will have outside Europe, namely in Gallipoli, in their attack on the Ottoman territories. That was one of the biggest defeats in the British war effort in the Near East, one of the biggest fiascos, but it was the baptism of fire for many of these committed Zionists that Jabotinsky was able to recruit to help them in that battle. And that was, for him, the first step towards creation of a bigger unit, actually a group of battalions that is called the Jewish Legion, that was important in creating his position and role, and also his image. As you can see from the slide in front of you, it was very important for Jabotinsky to distribute his photographs dressed in the uniform of the British Army. Some of the values later on of the revisionist Zionists are kind of anchored in the military experience of the British Army, sort of the images of tougher upper lip and discipline and obedience that is important for a disciplined soldier, unlike the Oriental savage Bedouin soldier. Now, in 1920, he would be one of the first people to organize the defense of Jerusalem against Arab riots, but actually that was crossing the line as far as the British authorities were concerned, and he becomes very quickly a persona non grata, someone that the British are looking at with great suspicion. In 1921, he became the member of the Zionist executive, but he quits it very quickly over policy differences, and it was in this context that he writes his famous essay on the Iron Wall. And you can see, therefore, given this context, how the essay played a role in showing why he could not, he finds it important to resign from the Zionist executive. And it would be immediately afterwards that he would found the Beitar movement. Beitar is an acronym for Brit Yosef Trumpeldor, the Zionist youth organization, and from there he will continue to found a separate revisionist movement. In 1935, the complete split will be in action. He will call together the first conference of the new Zionist organization, and he will become a leading, inspiring figure. It would be during the early months of World War II, before even America joined the war effort, that Jabotinsky, in exile, visited a Beitar camp in Hunter, New York, and there he would die of a heart attack, and not leaving a clear heir or a second in command that will lead the movement after him, and many would present themselves as the heir to the throne. We will talk about it in a few minutes. In 1964, Jabotinsky he was reburied in Israel, and I mentioned this because you could see how long it took for him to be reburied in Israel. The establishment in early statehood years, the labor Zionist and Ben Gurion, looked very unfavorably at Jabotinsky. At one stage, even Ben Gurion used the term Adolf Jabotinsky, comparing him with Adolf Hitler, and we'll talk about it in a second. Now, it is really essential, I think, to take seriously Jabotinsky's experience during World War I to understand his worldview and his turn to militarism. So when he's thinking about military efforts, he is thinking about a disciplined army, something very different from Hashomer, and he's also thinking about the type of effort that he was involved in the Gallipoli Peninsula, and together side by side with Joseph Trumpeldor. Joseph Trumpeldor, Captain Joseph Trumpeldor, was actually a Russian-trained military officer. He was decorated by the Russians when he fought in 1904 in the Japan-Russia war, where he lost his arm. He became iconic for being the one-armed officer. He would be, together with Jabotinsky, one of the architects of the Zion Mule Corps that fought in Gallipoli, but Trumpeldor would become a martyr when he would be killed later on in a very violent clash in a northern part of Palestine named Tel Hai. And Jabotinsky was going back to his comrade in arms from World War I, and the name of the group he founded, Beitar, was named after Trumpeldor, and that was part of the general message of the movement. Now, I started offering several possible date of birth to the Arab-Palestine conflict, but we moved progressively from World War I to the 1920s, but there is no doubt that if there is a climatic moment, or more accurately climatic years, these are the years 1936 to 1939 that are commonly known as the Great Arab Revolt. Sometimes Israeli historians like to refer to these events as the First Intifada. It broke out in April 1936. This is where an Arab attack on a Jewish bus led to a series of incidents that escalated very quickly into a major nationwide rebellion. One of the key differences between earlier riots and this case is not only the quantity and the scales of the riots and the fact that they continued for so long, but also the fact that there was already an Arab Higher Committee that, though it began as a loose coalition of recently formed Arab political parties, did create a political umbrella and a coordinating mechanism and leadership for the Arab resistance to the British forces. And I mentioned the fact that it is a very toxic moment in the chronicles of the Jewish Arab encounter in Palestine. But the Arab revolt was primarily, of course, directed against the British. The British were seen as the ones that are allowing the Jewish issue to grow. And officially, when it started as a national strike, their basic demands were very clear. Their demands were towards the British: seize all Jewish immigration and all further land sales to Jews, and establish an Arab national government. And these were the actions that swiftly escalated into terrorist attacks against Jews and the British. What is also very important to remember is that when the British suddenly understand the scales of the revolt, they realize that the revolt takes a lot of money and manpower from them, and they rely more and more on local local groups. And in that respect, they rely more and more on the Haganah and the Jewish settlements to help them to suppress the revolt. This is a highly contested and bitter moment in the chronicles of mandatory Palestine. This is one of the cases of a dirty counterinsurgency war, where it was very difficult to distinguish between civilian and non-civilian population. Also, some of the tactics that the British were using in order to suppress the revolt were notorious at the time. So, for instance, one of the things that the British suffered from tremendously is the fact that their roads, and both railroads and normal roads, were sabotaged or were under ambushes of Arab groups that were fighting against them. So they developed several techniques that are very questionable and, of course, would be considered completely illegal according to military codes of conduct today, including what you see in the photo in front of you. They will catch local peasants, Arab peasants, falahin, will put them either on the front of their trucks, the lorries as the British call them, or as you can see here, and will create some sort of a separate front car that they put these hostages on it. And if they will be attacked, or if there will be a booby trap or something that will wait this car, the first ones to lose their life are, of course, the Arabs, and this would be the way to make these Arab writers think twice before they are attacking the British soldiers. This is, of course, if you like, the origins of a very questionable tactic that in the Israeli army was codenamed neighbor procedure, that when Israeli soldiers had to enter into houses in Gaza or the West Bank, and they were afraid that it might be booby-trapped or someone is waiting for them, they would catch a neighbor and ask the local neighbor to be the first to knock on the door. This was, of course, banned by law. But if you'd like, these are one example or one symptoms of these dirty counterinsurgency wars that require a longer discussion that we won't have here. The 1936 revolt is also very important in the chronicles of Palestinian nationalism, even if you just look at it from the intellectual, political point of view. It would be in the context of the second half of the 30s that the most important texts that were seen as the foundations of Palestinian nationalism would be published, and maybe the most important of them is the book you see in front of you, The Arab Awakening by George Antonius, a Christian Arab, educated in Britain, has a Cambridge graduate, very articulate, very sophisticated, not exactly the Rashid Bey that Herzl believed, but someone that in early stages of his career believed that one should work with the British, and then found himself disillusioned and disappointed. This is a very one of the foundations of Palestinian nationalism, if one would like. So it's important for me that you will understand that, like in the case of Jewish that would later become Israelis, that violence and glues, in a sense, and provides a very important cement to a national identity. The same applies to the Palestinian identity. It would be in the context of increasing violence and riots that distinctive local Palestinian national identity will start to be crystallized, will be forged. if we return to some of the historical protagonists that I've mentioned earlier, such as Yigal Allon, the 1936 to 9 Arab Revolt is, of course, a very crucial episode in their career as well. In the photo in front of you that became sort of an iconic photo in the Chronicles of Zionism, you can see the young Yigal Allon on the right side of Yitzhak Sadeh, this a famous architect of a unit that was called the Foch, Plugot Sadeh, field companion units. And on the other side, you can see Moshe Dayan, iconic, famous Israeli general, who would later lose one of his eyes and will have a famous eye patch, sort of a pirate that will make him famous. So here's the young Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon, both graduates of the same agricultural school in Kaduri, and they are two of the members of the secret units that were working side by side with the British, helping them to suppress what they called the terror in the Galilee. And though in the Chronicles of Labor Zionism, there is a tendency to emphasize the way that this more offensive approach grew out of internal mechanisms, one will be cautious not to mention the fact that what provides the umbrella, the framework, and actually the training for these young men is the British Army, and most importantly, the special units in the British Army. The most important training that the young Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon will receive will come from Captain, later Major General, or Charles Wingate, colorful, eccentric, deeply religious British Protestant officer in the intelligence, and the founder of the SNS, which stands for the Special Night Squads. That was a secret sort of a commando unit that relied on the local Jewish fighters. They were the ones Wingate understood that knew the geography and the topography better. They're the ones that he taught them how to use commando tactics and drills, not to simply defend their villages and settlements on the fence, as they called, but go outside the fence deep in the thick of night and to surprise attack and the pockets of Arab resistance. And it will be to this day in Israel that there's a institute near Netanya that is called the Wingate Institute, where Israeli officers are being trained. And he went down in Israeli chronicles and collective memory as one of the friends, and even often was referred to not as Wingate, it simply as Hayadid, which stands in Hebrew for the friend or the ally. This is not the only evidence in Israel, in contemporary Israel. You can see to the that reminds you of these dramatic years of 1936 to 39. To this day, you can still see in Israel Taggart forts. What are the Taggart forts? These were type of militarized police forts that were constructed throughout Palestine by the British mandatory forces during the 1936-39 Arab Revolt. They were named after their designer, a British police officer named Sir Charles Taggart. He had his experience in other parts of the empire and brought this experience to Palestine. The idea was to have these heavily forted police stations. Between them, you will have smaller stations that were nicknamed pillboxes. And he designed them in 1938 based on his experience in suppressing the Indian insurgency. So you can see here an imperial colonial context. Palestine, in that respect, is part of a larger story of imperial counterinsurgency tactic. And they were built as reinforced concrete with their own water systems. And To this day, you can find many of these buildings in Israel. You won't be surprised to hear that in 1948, when the British left Palestine, these staggered forts would often be the sites of very bitter battles between Jews and Arabs that will try to capture these staggered forts. The famous fights over Latrun on the road to Jerusalem, or fights to capture the police station in Latrun that was a staggered fort. It was a very famous battle also in the northern part of Israel today, called Nebi Yusha, near a kibbutz named Ayelet HaShachar. That was also an attempt to capture another staggered fort. And in many of these staggered forts that exist to this day, you will find nowadays Israeli police station. So thus I conclude this part, and we will move immediately to part 4 of our lecture.